Life is difficult and unfair. Everyone is dealing with something at almost every waking moment. Whether you're battling mental illness, you hate where you live, you dislike your job, or there's someone out there deliberately making your day worse, everyone is dealing with something. And often, these things will interrupt each other because there is no mutual exclusivity in life. For some, a thing that they must deal with every day is a personal discomfort. Misery assigned at conception, like a government-mandated tumor. An assignment of a gender to a person for whom it does not fit, whether they know it or not. Eventually, some of these people decide to wear who they truly believe they are, to embody their correct gender identity. So while everyone has their struggles, often a transgender person has an additional layer on top. A transgender person might be finding keeping on top of their finances difficult. They may have fallen off of a ladder, or been involved in a car accident just like anyone else. But they may also be thinking about potentially seeking hormone replacements, finding clothes that shape their body to how it should be shaped, dealing with legal and medical issues, and avoiding harassment. As a cisgender person, I had never fully empathized with a transgender person's daily challenges. I knew it was difficult and unpleasant. Being harassed for wanting to be yourself isn't an enjoyable experience, but I had never really considered everything else. Pagan Autogeny showed me what I hadn't considered, and my friend Ashley showed me what I didn't have correct. Pagan Autogeny is the precursor to Oleander Garden's Eventide Sigil, and the similarities are many, although there are a few major differences. Firstly, both games are first-person games, with a handful of weapons to gather throughout the world. The shooting in both games is very basic, although Autogeny does feature melee weapons, which were not present within Eventide Sigil. The reasons the player has access to these weapons is also rather vague. There are very few enemies to battle in either game, but Autogeny's encounters are much more complex. The enemies aren't bringing this complexity, however. The game's buffing system does that. The player character has a few different stats and characteristics that change as the game goes on. The characteristics affect how the character plays. Their health, their movement speed, their damage output, and the damage intake. There are armor pieces and a variety of tarot cards to collect to alter these characteristics. The stats include murder levels, caffeine levels, poetry levels, body forging levels, and estrogen levels. These don't directly impact the game, but increasing them to 10 is almost required in order to defeat one of the game's enemies. This is generally done by collecting items throughout the world, or by killing things in the murder stats case. These stats tied into something that I had initially considered one of the game's main themes, but as I've reflected more, I no longer really consider it so. In order to raise the character's estrogen stat, the player must collect pill bottles, which are presumably estrogen supplements as part of the character's hormone replacement therapy. My initial impression of this was that the character had to complete this task, whether they wanted to or not. Now I see it among the list of these stats as part of the daily routine. Vivian, the player character, drinks coffee, writes poems, and takes medications every day, which is far more humanizing than my original reading. No, it's the body forging that is the primary vehicle for Autogeny's themes. Body forging within Pagan Autogeny is a stat that can only be increased by placing pieces of a mannequin back onto its body. A body with breasts, and legs adorned with knee-length socks. This task must be completed multiple times. The unsatisfactory construction results in an anxiety-driving sequence, as a sculpture is raptured into the sky, before the game declares the attempt a failure and shuts itself down. This repeated return to the mannequin definitely spoke to me, each attempt at a formed body being a test for a potential identity that would be desirable for the player character. Whether the player had defeated all of their demons beforehand would determine if their attempts at a new identity are successful. Of course, these are my interpretations, and, as Ashley pointed out, shouldn't be considered the creator's desired reading. The game's narrative aspects are fairly light, but the world building is exceptional. Upon starting the game, the player is shown a booting screen for something called Plaza 96, and is shown that the user logging into the program uses the name Vivian. The player is then left within the Transworld Station, a train station mall from which the player can begin their excursion into the long-forgotten MMO. The objective of the MMO is to collect 4 specific tarot cards, use them to free the martyr, then learn of the secrets she guards. There are some NPCs to speak with. They seem to be other players rather than Plaza 96 NPCs, since they say things like, "Wanna get a raid group going?" and "You should log in more." It's light, but the presentation is where a lot of the game's narrative development has been placed. If I were to pick a word, any word, just a single word to describe the visual style of Pagan Autogeny, it would most likely be a word that I have used before. That word, being one that I have used before, was used to describe a game that was also developed by Oleander Garden. Utilitarian was the word, and it absolutely applies here. Some of the assets are even the same, which is a good demonstration of why I choose to use that word specifically. The environment models are simple shapes with flat or low resolution textures spread across them. The characters are also simplistic, often being either a floating cuboid object or a far more detailed but far less cohesive model. The magnificent noise filter that the game is presented through is doing so much of the work, throwing the game's atmospheric qualities through the stratosphere. The dark environments are suffocating, while the brighter areas are airy and feel very liberating. The low view distance seems to create a lot of the tension. I found myself nervous as I travelled, unsure what could jump out of the fog to startle me. And yet, the game never does this. Well, excluding that one time.
Oh, okay, wait. Oh, there we go. Okay, hello sir, can I interest you in some chocolate for the Girl Scouts?
The suspense is entirely drawn from the player's imagination. The low visibility and the unexpected sounds leading many to assume that there's something sinister hiding just out of view. So you're lured into walking around slowly, carefully, even fearfully, expecting something that never comes. The filter has the added benefit of making the game's world seem gigantic. If the player can't see the boundaries, and they're cautiously creeping through the world, then finding those boundaries takes a lot longer than expected. Plaza is a strange place, mainly because the geography makes very little coherent sense. But at the same time, I think the way each area links into the other areas is very impressive. The player is dropped into the transverse station at the start of the game, a location that only connects to 2 other places. One exit leads to the main external hub of the game, this outdoor location filled with marshland and ruins, while the other exit involves walking along the train tracks, which spits the player out at a subsiding shed within a rural area. This rural area has a few other exits, but not nearly as many as the swampy area. The player can either enter a shack and use a teleporter item to teleport to another location, or they can interact with the car and drive through a city to a red-tinted tangle of alleyways. The alley has an exit that leads to the swampy area, while the painting teleporter takes the player to the interior of a ruin within the marshlands. It's possible to walk in circles throughout the world, but every path will eventually find its way back to the swamp, and back to the ruined building that contains the mannequin, as well as one of the enemies the player must defeat. There are 4 enemy encounters that must be defeated in order to release the martyr from her bounds and reach an ending. The first most players are likely to encounter, and be able to defeat, is a shaman boss within the ruined temple. This enemy stands at the back of a long room and summons fireballs that will track the player through the room. There are a few different methods to defeat this enemy, but I found that running in circles in front of the creature allowed me to avoid the fireballs and get frequently near enough for my shotgun to deal significant damage. There is a cloak nearby that increases the player's movement speed, so I believe this is the intended method to defeat this enemy, although strafing around it also seemed to work. What Ashley can confirm is that trying to peek out at the enemy from behind cover is not the most effective strategy.
There we go. Now we're in business. Oh!
Oh no.
Come on.
I feel like this enemy is very video gamey, and if there is a reading to be made here, I'm not really sure what it is. The next enemy is hidden within a factory that's located in the rainy rural area. Interacting with a television inside the factory causes a golden skull to spawn and begin firing fireballs at the player. These projectiles don't track the player, but this enemy is resistant to certain attacks if the player has specific tarot cards in their possession. In terms of an analogous being, I think this creature being introduced as a demon is a bit of a clue. With these two enemies defeated, the player must then make their way into the desert region, one of the few locations that only has one entrance and exit, but also contains the doorway to the Scarab King's lair. The Scarab King's health total isn't immediately revealed to the player, since it starts so high. But since the humanoid creatures moving around the desert drop strength cards, it's quite easy to damage the scarab a lot and take it down. The little scarabs flying all over the room are somewhat dangerous, so keeping the speed cloak equipped is most certainly a good idea. Finally, there's the enemy positioned before the key to the ending. This monster guards the entrance to the podium that dispenses the tarot card that undoes the martyr's bounds. Equipping the card found in the armory and shooting at the big creature is all it takes to win the battle. The model is quite strange. It looks like a limbless torso floating on some blue vapors. No idea. I like the sound it makes though. So what happens when the martyr is freed? What is uncovered upon breaking their restraints? Before we proceed, I'd like to encourage you to go and purchase this game, and play it for yourself if you haven't already done so. The journey's conclusion is much more abstract than the rest of the game, and I think that the mystery is definitely worth uncovering for oneself. It's $10 AUD on Steam, but you can also support the creator directly via itch.io. It takes a few completed assemblies of the mannequin to reach 10 in body forging, so the player will experience the rapture event a couple of times before the true ending sequence begins. Upon laying the world card upon the altar within the marsh, the martyr's bonds will be broken, and the next assembly of the mannequin will open a passage to the final area in the game. With the restraints gone, the world begins to crumble, and ghosts spread across the marshland, and the player can enter the pathway behind the martyr's former prison, where they find themselves surrounded by apartment buildings. This town is towered over by a smoke-spewing chimney, while the rumble of a faintly musical sound crowds the player's ears. After passing through the neighborhood a little further, another tunnel. Darkness, and a new mechanical vibrating sound overcome the player. It gets louder and louder as they approach the source, the ominous rattle transforming into static with a faintly musical quality itself. Then, the player reaches the end of the path, and the martyr stands solitary in the darkness. The static sounds get even more extreme, and whatever light shines upon the sculpture also seems to be filled with its own kind of static. The world card hangs in the darkness, invisible from behind, Once the player finally reaches the martyr and interacts with the sculpture, the darkness and the noise are eliminated. The screen turns white and the coda appears. The coda is an optimistic piece. The challenges are behind us now. We are free to be who we always were. That anxiety has finally been overcome. I don't know these anxieties, but I think Pagan Autogeny has opened my eyes to a particular transgender experience. Ashley told me that there is no singular transgender experience, much like the lack of a singular cisgender experience. Everyone has different circumstances. Perhaps Garden's experience has been similar to the emotional adventure that those who engage with her game experience. Perhaps Garden's experience was similar to Ashley's more accommodating journey. It isn't possible to really know for certain, and I think that's the reason Autogeny is presented in this way. Transgenderism is one of the game's major themes, but the narrative has been left to the player's interpretation. I had some expectation of deducing an understanding of some all-encompassing revelation. I was naive enough to think that playing a video game would allow me to understand everything a transgender person experiences, as if it all happened in a single day, and it was all caused by a single event. But that simply is not the case. What is true, though, is that Pagan Autogeny is a fantastic icebreaker in regards to this topic, and if you want to learn more about someone, you should talk with them. You might make a new friend. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to Ashley Whiskey and Saoirse for helping me out with this one. Next week, we're partying.